Welcome! This is my very first video for Patreon. I am giving this a test. We're going to be doing a smaller piece, a 5x7. I have my Arches hot pressed watercolor paper, my watercolor palette right here, and my sketchbook for inspiration. This piece is going to be Nuria Strix, My Lady of the Barn Owl Skull. And we're going to do without the mask, get to know her a little bit better, and kind of recreate some of her character design. It's a little passion project that I am working on here on Patreon and sharing with you guys. So we'll give a first list off what I am using. My palette here is pretty messy, so step one is going to be cleaning it a little bit. But first we'll show you everything that I use. So as far as pencils, I like to start with a soft HB pencil. This will help because I'm kind of heavy-handed to do a very light sketch to get my proportions correct before I really start putting in anything permanent. Once I get ready for the permanent stage, I use my Blackwing Pearl. This one, I think it's time for a new one, but I think I could still get some use out of this. I like to use them until they can't fit in the pencil sharpener anymore. So we're gonna give that a go. I have a little, gosh, this eraser has to have been from college, so it is about over 10 years old. I must not make very many mistakes. That's a good thing, right? Okay, my watercolors, they are watercolor instead of gouache. There are a couple on my palette that are gouache. Those are the only exceptions. I strictly have used Winsor & Newton professional grade since learning from masters at college. And I've since branched out to a few other brands just for certain colors, whether or not they carry similar colors in Winsor & Newton. I haven't found quite the same results. So one of my favorites is Opera Rose, and this is Winsor & Newton professional watercolor. They've kind of um, since the past couple years maybe repackaged their colors. The old ones used to look a little bit more like this, but if you see them like this in the store now, these are the same. So this is Sepia, another one of my favorites. Winsor & Newton. Neutral tint. Neutral tint and sepia are really, really nice blended together. They create very nice gradients. I like neutral tint instead of a jet black for areas that are well, like achieving the smoky eye, and anything kind of more of a smoky black and then leaving the very jet black for a different color. Naples yellow is another one of my favorites to help blend with the skin tones. And cerulean blue is another one of my favorites. This one granulates a lot, and we will get into that. I will hopefully be able to demonstrate a good example of granulation. For my skin tones, I always use this flesh tint as a base. And this is the designer's gouache, the one exception on my palette, and it is also Winsor & Newton Series 1. And these, I started out buying the little tubes, and they're obviously cheaper, but have since decided I need to just buy these big ones because I end up rebuying them all the time. But if you're a beginner, it's good to start out with the little ones. They are more expensive than the Cotman brand, but they're just so much better. It's there's frustrations that may happen with the Cotman. It's just, I believe, more filler. I may be wrong on that, but it seems that they get muddier faster. That's how I've noticed it anyway. Um, and as far as those jet black areas like eyelashes and any of the deepest crevices, I suppose you could say, I use my Holbein acrylic gouache jet black. And this is, I believe, something you would have to purchase on Holbein's website. They don't seem to carry it on Amazon. I tend to do most of my supply shopping on Amazon now that I know exactly what to rebuy. But your local, even Michael's and other art stores should have Winsor and Newton. Okay, so that is my paints. As far as brushes, I like to use some cheapies. Definitely replace these a lot. So these two have lasted me a really long time, mostly because they're not going to get much wear and tear. These are going to be for bigger areas where you're really just throwing down water. So they don't get scrubbed too much. And this guy has been very, very awesome. This is a Robert Simmons E85 round. 6, I believe, is what that would be, not a 9. 6? I think it's a 6. um, and this guy is going to be good for a little bit more fine tuning, but not the finest. For that, I buy really, really cheapies that go through a lot of wear and tear, and then they can be easily replaced because they were only $2, $3. So right now I have a Princeton brush. This is a 0. This one is a Zen, and it is a 3. And then this guy is Artist Loft, and it's a 20. So 20 over 0. That's probably important. Yeah, they're tiny. So um, those get replaced often. And I have my little cup of water here. This is a really awesome travel one that folds down. And then my palette. So I am ready to sketch this out. We're going to tape down, since it is just a loose piece of Arches hot press watercolor paper. This was actually from one of the blocks. I usually use, here's a fresh unopened one. So this is what it looks like in the store. They tend to not carry hot press as often, but it is on Amazon. So I end up just ordering because they really like, I mean, most people prefer the cold press, which is going to be toothy. In other words, it is going to have a rough surface, which I find it hard to draw on. So since this is a single sheet of paper, it will kind of get a little bit wavy. And I also like to tape off just so that I make sure I'm not painting all the way to the edges. Something that the professors back in college did not allow, so it's kind of stuck in my head. I think it looks a little bit more professional, but it's kind of up to you. It makes matting and framing a lot easier, just because you're not having to cover some of the artwork. I've also learned over the years to make sure that I'm doing more more of the typical frame size dimensions on my pieces so that it doesn't cost a fortune to frame them. And I'm not really framing too much of my own work these days, but I have my customers in mind that I would hate for them to spend more on the frame than they did on the art. So unless it's a really, really beautiful frame and it's worth it, of course, because that is an art form. Okay, so I just used any artist tape for that. You don't want to use anything that's going to pull the paper right off, so make sure that it's artist tape. So, Nuria, this is my sketchbook. I've done a few character designs of her and played with some different hairstyles, and she's kind of got a Jane Austen era feel to her. So that is my inspiration. And pulling inspiration will be a whole nother theme for a different video. So we're gonna zoom you into this a little bit more so you can see what I'm doing. So when I start drawing, I've got a little bit of an idea of what I'm going to be trying to achieve, but I really usually will have a little thumbnail next to it. I kind of have a good idea, especially for something that's going to be more on the simple side. So we're going to put her mostly just want to demonstrate the start to finish with these videos. So with drawing, you know, your basic art how-to books are going to tell you to start out with shapes, and that's exactly what I do. So I'm just kind of figuring it out as I go, really. Of course, that takes a lot of practice, but so each one of these skull masquerade ladies have an animal skull or creature or mythical beast, and hers is a barn owl. So I've kind of started to create some story content with these girls and decided that they all kind of need a little spirit animal of each of their own individual skulls. So hers is going to be, she's going to have this little barn owl, which I know he's going to be right there, but I should pull up a barn owl reference. References are great. Don't be afraid to use them. Just make sure that you make it your own. So, let's see. Okay, that guy's cute. All right. And also on these early stages of your drawing, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to erase and kind of start over. Um, with watercolor paper, there is only so much that you can kind of do as far as wear and tear, but just make sure that you're um, really happy with what you've got before you start painting, because there's really not much you can do to change your composition once you're laying water down. So these animals are also going to have kind of a silhouette. Um, they're kind of shadows and spirits, so we're going to test how that looks. And I actually don't really even know fully how I'm going to achieve that, so it's going to be an experiment. And you all get to see it. Okay, so there she is. Something fun about creating character designs is playing with all these different features, different facial features, different body features, and really making each one unique. So I'm having a fun time deciding what kind of faces they have underneath these masks that I've created. And I've got her as kind of a more of a square shaped face. And to kind of mimic the shape of the owl's nose, I've kind of decided to give her a wider base, nose base, I guess. Something a little bit reminiscent of an owl, and kind of wider spread eyes. Just slightly though. So since I've got everything mapped out now, Now is the time to go in with my Palomino Blackwing, and I'll get you guys closer in so you can see all these details. Oops. And this is where you want to be sure, it's always a good idea to kind of hold it up and make sure that you are liking it. And actually looking at it that way, I think I'm going to make a little bit of an alteration here. I think it needs, her shoulder needs to come down a little bit, which is okay because these legs should be a little bit longer. That's better. All right. So for this, ever so slightly, just adding the very, very darkest parts, because with watercolor, you are going to still see the pencil lines showing through. So you want to make sure that your pencils look nice. I tend to start with the eyes, mostly just because it's fun. I find that when I'm working on the hair, it kind of takes on a life of its own with the brush strokes. So I actually don't put too many details in. Really just making a basic shape with the hair. One of my favorite things to do with hair is kind of figuring out which way it's spinning to make sense of it. A lot of the pinup hair that I do is like a finger wave, and you kind of have to make sense of it a little bit. So that took a little bit of research for me to understand exactly which way it was supposed to spin, and a lot of practice. And for something this small, I try not to spend more than 30 minutes on the drawing because that tends to mean that you're overcomplicating it for such a small space. That's just me. That's just personal choice. There are plenty of people who can do some really detailed stuff, tiny, tiny. But I know my own style with watercolor will end up getting very overcomplicated. So these are going to be kind of ruffles. I had lace in there originally, but I think it's going to be more of like a ruffle. Something with a little bit of a harder edge because it's kind of my framing the piece. So that's nice. So I had this vision of this little owl having kind of like a little vest, with a stopwatch or pocket watch. I think it'd be kind of cute. And that kind of gives me a good spot right there. Okay, so when you're done with your pencil, it's a good time to kind of clean up the lines. Like I said, if there's, I'll get you in even closer. If there are any unwanted pencil lines, like you can see some of this back here is a little dirty, it's a little messy, but it's going to be covered with a darker color. Her hair color, I believe I used sepia, so none of that's going to show. But what will show is any of these lines on her face. So clean that up a little bit. I do like having some dramatic blush, so we'll just pinpoint that area now. But this can be cleaned up. Looks good. Okay. So we're going to prep the area for some paint, and I want you to kind of be able to see what I'm mixing too. So, like I said before, this palette is pretty messy. So we just get a damp paper towel and put that up there now. And I just like to clean these portions for each piece so that I'm not reusing any of the same, unless I'm using the same exact color palette, then I'll leave that on there because why waste it? But my last piece on this is set from doing a mermaid that had a lot of really bright blues, so we're not doing that this time around. Okay. So much better, right? So, first things first, you go light to dark when you're painting. So, you want to start with anything that you already know is going to be light. For instance, I will be making the background kind of just a glowy, drippy, blobby color. So that needs to go first, for sure. And to do wet on wet means that you put a puddle of water down and throw some wet paint in there. See what happens. Now with this, you want to make sure you're not getting any of the areas that you need to leave white. So I'm going to be mixing a little bit of my cerulean blue with a little bit of my flesh tone actually, and some violets. And it's kind of just gonna, a little bit of a grayish tone, but I like mixing my own grays so that they have all these hints of other colors. So you can kind of just throw things in there as you go. So I'm just kind of mixing off of all that I just listed off. And I like to do a little bit of splashes. And there's different wetnesses that do different things. It's kind of fun to experiment with. Um, I will be waiting for kind of an eggshell shine. That's still a little bit too wet. So like right here, it's looking a little bit ready. That is the time that you can put you can throw some just clear water and it will actually show the paper through again in little splashes. So it's not quite ready for that. I'm going to do a little bit more blue. And this is a really light color, so you're not going to see it too much, but I think this area is ready. And this is all stuff that you just kind of learn by playing. Don't ever be afraid to play with some experiments with your watercolor. It's really how you get the best results is accidents, happy accidents. And this kind of gives off that salt effect, but it's just a little bit more subtle. So you can see it's kind of taking away some of the pigment, but very hard to see. It is very light. So next thing is going to be the skin tone, which she's going to be very pale, and I'm actually going to use some of these colors right here. It sometimes is useful to put some of your background colors into different spots of the piece so that it ties it all together. Not always, but sometimes. So to achieve a lighter color, you just add more water. You don't really add any white. So this over here is, it is a white gouache that I sometimes throw in with skin tone, just because it helps it kind of stay creamy consistency is what I like to say. But really, you can be wiping it up if it's too dark. So put down an even tone first. And then, like I said, if it's too dark in some areas, you can always lift it up. And as it's still wet, I'm going to be switching to a finer tuning brush. And I'm going to mix my shadow, skin shadow color, and throw some of those shadows in so that they're soft while the water's still on there from that first coat. And then with a damp brush, you can spread it to only the desired areas. So if you can't quite tell, there's a little bit of shadows in there. And that's something that you'll just be building up little by little. Now, while it's still kind of damp, it's a good time to throw in some of that blush. And I mix a little bit of Opera Rose, Alizarin Crimson, and Windsor Red for this. And it's going to look drastic at first, but you can always blend it if you catch it fast enough. And one thing to remember as you're beginning to use watercolor is that it's always going to dry just a little bit lighter. So if you're kind of scared that you put too much down, just experiment a little bit and see, after it dries, you might be happy with it. It's one of the reasons it's really hard to get really deep colors with watercolor because it's always going to just dry a little bit lighter. All right. I like doing intense blush like that. I think it's fun. So, another light thing on here is going to be her frills down here. So, we're just going to throw in just where the shading is. And I've practiced a lot at college actually, just um, different exercises with a white shirt that's crinkled. That's always a good exercise to do. If you happen to have a white shirt, just crinkle it up, throw it in a pile, drape it over the side of a chair, and just practice drawing the wrinkles. It can come in handy in so many different ways. Okay. I'm probably going to continue with some more of those. I kind of switch off. That's part of the reason that I can work so fast is that I can predict kind of how long each area is going to take to dry. So that's something that you can get better at over time. But knowing to kind of let an area sit is good so that you're not overworking it and tearing the paper. So obviously, if there's any puddles on the paper still and you want a hard edge, you have to avoid that area. So I just put a shadow under her bottom lip, so I'm not going to paint the lips right now. I'm just going to work on the eyes instead. So that's just kind of something that you're multitasking the whole time. If it was the this same process, putting makeup on your actual face, I'd be so good at it, but it's a whole different art form putting all the different powders and brushes and all that different stuff that with makeup that I don't know. Okay. Now for the eyebrow, it's going to be the same color as her hair, which is going to be a sepia. For eyebrows, I like to have my brush very, very dry. It kind of helps separate the different hairs so that they all kind of leave their own streak. But it can't be too dry or you won't get anything out. So there's a delicate balance there. Just kind of one of those tricks to make it a little bit faster. And for doing that angle, I'm going to put that upside down. There's some good brows. And I haven't actually decided what her eye color is going to be. So I think she's going to have really dark eyes to kind of mimic the barn owl. And they just have little black dots, so it's going to be like a black brown. Okay, we're going to keep layering that smoky eye. And this is again with kind of a drier brush. Okay, so we're going to let that dry before I put any of the really tight details of the eyeliner and eyelashes. And we'll move on to the lips, which are going to match the cheeks a little bit. I usually throw in a little bit of the neutral tint or the flesh tint just because lips are still kind of skin toned underneath, so it helps match it unless you've got really vibrant lipstick on. And for the bottom lip, as long as there's general lighting from above head, the bottom lip is going to be the one that has the shine, and it'll be a little bit lighter, so I just mix more water than the top lip. So, and the very corners will need some shadows, and I like to use some violet for most of my shadows. Okay, so her face is pretty complete. Everything left is going to be the funnest part, using this jet black. So I think it's time to do that. Usually you wait until the very end, to put the darkest darks on there, but I just get so excited. So we're gonna put it on. And since this is technically acrylic and gouache mixed together, it does get to this point where it's too dry to even use again. So I don't squeeze a bunch of it out. I try and guess how much I'm going to use, which, since it is part gouache, it mixes with water really well. So it's kind of a hybrid of the two, which just makes it very weird and confusing. But I just get so much joy out of putting the eyeliner on. Okay, that's looking awesome. So now just the other tiny, tiny blackest blacks. Usually going to be the nostrils, the little tiny crease at the end of the mouth, and then anything on the inside, we'll leave a little bit for her teeth. And then usually a little bit on the inside of the ear. And while I'm here, I am giving her some piercings. So I might as well do that. It's kind of become one of my signature things that I keep doing is a series of little piercings like that. Cool. Well, I like that. Now we're going to put some of the darks on. So zoom out a little. So for the hair and for this, I'll probably do this first because the hair is on top and there may be some details of little strands that will be coming down that would be impossible to paint around, so they have to go on top. So on top of doing light to dark, you're kind of layering what's on top of what. So all of those little things to keep in mind. And this is going to be mostly sepia, probably mix some other various ochres that I've forgotten which one's in which spot. That looks good. And the owl is going to be mostly black, so it's kind of a shadow. So that'll be the very last thing. So I don't have to worry about painting around him too much. And like usual, put a little bit of violet in my shadows. I think it looks nice. And now to do some highlights, you take a clean brush and you're going to get most of the water off, so you just kind of dab it on your paper towel and you can go in there and carve away some of these highlights, pull them out. And of course, this is with a lot of experimenting and practice under my belt with lighting. So I'm kind of just creating a general light source that has a little bit of a soft light to it. Nothing too tricky. In college we did tons and tons of life drawing, so if you feel like you are lost, definitely recommend doing some life drawing, even if it's just asking your friend to sit for you, or geez, if somebody you know falls asleep, just start painting them. paint of the park, whatever you have to do. Learning from what's in front of you is always good. Always good practice. Okay, so we're going to do, it's still a little bit wet, but that's okay because some of this can be soft. I'm going to throw in some shadows with this brush. And you'll notice I'm doing this after I've pulled my highlights out because doing it the other way around will just end up smearing all of your shadows. I'm honestly not even quite sure how this mechanism of her neck piece works, but it's a bunch of straps. That's the general idea. Okay, that looks nice. And while I'm over here, I'm going to kind of use that same sepia and violet mixture to do the shadows, deepest shadows of this. Okay, so the fun part, the hair. Since it's such a big area, we're going to do this brush, and this is going to be mostly just throwing down the a flat base coat that is going to have a little bit of um, highlighting and shadowing just based on my brush um, placement. So this is something that you really have to practice to get the hang of, but the general rule is that you will start to lift some paint um, the harder you press. So if you want it to be darker, you apply less pressure, and if you want it to be lighter, then you start to press down and lift it. So that's something that I do while I'm doing the hair, just to help with each individual section's lighting. But it is definitely tricky, so experiment a lot. And one thing I like to do to kind of make this hairline softer is to apply a little bit of water right there so that when it runs into that, it's not just a straight line. this is going to be very opaque. And we're just going to block it in to the general area. So if you can tell, there's different things happening with each section. So that will give you a rough base, and it's not perfect, but it will get there with some details. So while this is still wet, kind of didn't achieve what I was hoping over here, but we can kind of blend it ourselves. Okay, we'll come back to that area later because it is still very wet. So now we'll do this little ponytail. So now here's where you'll see it. I'm going to apply, this was with little pressure, and now this is with a lot of pressure. And you kind of just let it pool up at the bottom. So we're going to do that again for this shine. And that is a nice little cheat to making some ringlets. Okay, so some of this is a little bit dry enough to do. I'll just go straight to a small brush so that I can get all these little flyaway hairs, which are some of my favorites, just doing these little flyaways. And I'm kind of deciding, so I've got a darker color, so this is kind of deciding each individual chunk where it's going and where it's tucked in.
And these flyaways just I just kind of let them happen naturally, wherever it feels like it needs a little shape. Again, this is where understanding what direction the hair is spinning comes in handy. And like I mentioned, I was going to do one of these flyaways. Nice. And that is the hair. And it really should be as simple as that. If you are doing every single strand, it's probably going to end up getting muddy and frustrating. So simplifying it, experimenting with just those little steps should create better results. So hopefully that was helpful. Okay, now I need that. Um, I need some more of that blackest of black, but I'm going to make myself wait until the very end. I've made kind of like an X, kind of like ribbon that the this one has. So I'm playing off of that idea for this design as well. Okay, so now we have to kind of figure out this owl and how I'm going to make him kind of a shadow spirit thing. So mostly thinking this lovely neutral tint is going to be key because it's going to be kind of mostly gray. I may use a little bit of that cerulean blue so that it granulates and is fun. Another one that granulates is Mars Black, and I might throw a little bit of that in there too. Mars Black has more of a warm tone, whereas neutral tint is a cool tone. So those are things to keep in mind. They're both really good for making smoky gray. So let's give it a shot. And I'm going to be keeping the eyes white, so it's kind of inverted a little bit. And there's just so many things with watercolor that watercolor does on its own that is so fun to play with. So we really want to use watercolor to its fullest, right? So kind of make this bleed out into a soft edge. Throw some water in there. See what happens. Throw some water in where the feathers would be. And then of course we're just going to blob in some shadows. And it's always fun to throw some other colors into your gray just to make it a little interesting. Okay, so I like that. I think he needs to be a little bit darker, and for that I'll go in while it's still wet. And I'm kind of mixing both Payne's Gray and or Payne's Gray, neutral tint and Mars Black. And his little chain is going to be gold, but the part that's going to be part of the shadow, we're going to lift that with some white. talons on him. Okay, there's your little owl friend. And we'll do the very blackest black details with this. And I may throw some really dark darks, like anywhere that it would be absolutely the furthest push back. So it's usually in like any of these creases. And we'll put some on the owl too. Okay, finishing stages is going to be my only really opaque um, medium, which is going to be Copic Opaque White. And this is going to be for very, 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 very small little highlights. This is just going to help to really bring to life. And the good thing is that it mixes really well with water, so you can blend it out. And this is really good just for things that are nearly impossible to avoid and save. You want to save a lot of the white of the paper, but if it is between doing this and using a masking fluid, I prefer this. I think there's a little bit more control, but there there are people that like to use masking fluid instead, and it's for the same idea. And one last little thing that I sometimes do at the very end is a little bit of texture for the background. And if you're afraid of ruining your faces, you can kind of cover them. Unless it blows away. Right there. Oh, I forgot one thing. So we are at, took about 30 minutes to pencil it and about an hour to paint it. And that's pretty good for something um, this detailed. Uh, just keeping things kind of simpler and doing a few hacks definitely helps. But there we are. And we're done. Bye.